We'll get started. We are going to be making our way through Isaiah chapter 21, verses 11 through 17. But as always, before we can do that, we must do what we always do, back up, review what we talked about last week, so that we keep everything in its proper context. Now, last week we made our way through Isaiah chapter 21, verses 1 through 10. And it's in those verses from last week that God has given Isaiah the vision of Babylon falling. Babylon was a massive empire during that time. Babylon was taking whatever land they wanted. They had this huge, powerful army. So for the ancient times to think that this empire was going to fall would be much like the world today believing that the United States is going to crumble. That's just how powerful Babylon was. Now, it's in this vision of Babylon falling that we see something from Isaiah. This vision crushes him. And we're not certain if it's because this vision is a bit more graphic, but we know that there's something about it that actually brings Isaiah to his knees. But not only does it bring him to his knees, but he is sick at his stomach. And although this is a vision, he is trying to turn from this vision. That's how graphic it was, or so we believe. But it was this war that was going to fall upon Babylon by way of God's wrath that brought Isaiah to this point. And we see God coming through Isaiah in a way because we're seeing how it is that God created Isaiah, this empathetic man who felt bad for Babylon. Even though Babylon was this wicked empire, it was a pagan empire. They had numerous gods that they served. They did not serve the one true God. Yet here, Isaiah, through this vision, is seeing this destruction. And you know that from his point of view, that being Isaiah, there's nothing more that he wanted than for them to be rescued in a sense of salvation. However, that was not God's plan. That was not in God's will. So Babylon was not going to repent and turn to the Lord, but they would fall underneath God's almighty wrath. Now, what is it that we know about Babylon? We know that they are a prideful empire. They believe that everything that they had was because of themselves. They did not look to the one true God and thank him for all the blessings that he had given them. No, they created their own gods to worship. Which really, what is that? It just shows how narcissistic man is, that they pick and choose the attributes of God that they want, and they create their own gods to worship and serve. But there is a time when God's patience is going to run out on the wicked. And it's through this vision that God is showing Isaiah that his patience was going to run out. God's wrath was going to come for them, and it finally did. And we know that through the scripture, we know it's going to be around 539 BC. So even though this vision was given to Isaiah in the 700s, there was going to be a period of time where God was going to show his grace upon Babylon a little bit longer. Now this oracle continues, this vision continues, but this time it's going towards the allies of Babylon. Those who agree to partner with Babylon, God is going to come after them as well. And this next oracle, it's extremely brief. We don't have a lot of information. And it's about Edom. And again, we don't have a lot of details about this, other than the fact that we know that Edom partnered with Babylon. Edom partnered with the wicked. And all of this is taking place to show us what? That God was showing his own. And remember what God told his own. That you're going to hear about these wars. You are going to be terrified, but the one thing you are not going to do, you cannot do, is turn to a foreign army to protect you. You turn to me. I will be your provider. I will be your protector. But we know that the land of Judah, they ran to Egypt. God destroyed Egypt, crushed their army to do what? To show Judah that there's no pagan army who can rescue them, who can save them, that it is him and him alone. And we're seeing the same thing take place as God is going to destroy Babylon and then all of their allies. Once again, showing his own that they cannot run to a foreign army for protection, that he is the only one who can protect them. We're just seeing this disobedience from God's people. Now let's dive into Isaiah chapter 21, starting in verse 11. The oracle concerning Dumah. Now Dumah was an oasis, and it was located in northern Arabia. Now it was important during this time because of its trade route between the Persian Gulf and Petra. It's also a primary route running northward from the Red Sea to Palmyra. So think about this section of Dumah and how important it was. It was this central hub for trade. And then you have the land of Edom. That would be the Edomites. They were descendants of Jacob, that's brother Esau. So the Edomites would have this great interest in this land. Because if Dumah were to fall to the Assyrians, then Edom would be cut off from the eastern trade, meaning they would lose support from Babylon. So you see why it was so important for Edom to make sure, to be concerned about this central hub of trade. Because they were afraid that if the Assyrians were going to attack them, they would need the protection of Babylon. So what is it that God does? Dumah was going to be under attack. Dumah, that central trade route, was going to be taken away from Edom. Again, who was Edom? Who were they depending on? Not God. They wanted nothing to do with God. They were depending on Babylon. So God was going to take that central trade hub from them. Now in this vision, look how this goes. It says, one is calling to me from Seir. Now, of course, Seir is referring to Edom. There was a Mount Seir in the region of Edom. So that's how we know that we're speaking of the Edomites here. So one is calling to me from Seir. So this would be the watchman. The watchman who we talked about last week. You recall last week when we talked about the watchman who was keeping watch over the foreign army coming in. So here this watchman is. Edom was going to send a messenger to this watchman. Now this is all just part of the vision playing out, okay? So Edom being concerned, they're going to send a messenger to the watchman because they understand the watchman knows. He has been given this gift from God, so he knows what is going to be taking place. So here Edom, terrified, sends the watchman. And look what it says. The messenger asked, "Watchman, what time of the night?" Meaning this, if Assyria takes Dumah, how long will Assyria rule over us? That was the primary concern of Edom. How long is Assyria going to rule over us? But they didn't like what Isaiah had to say. So they would send another messenger, which is why we have the repeat. Watchman, what time of the night? How long will Assyria oppress us? Now the darkness, of course, is a representation of Assyria, the wicked reigning over them. So Assyria was going to conquer them. That was part of the vision, and it wasn't going to be pretty. Now the watchman continues, look at verse 12. The watchman says, morning comes and also the night. If you will inquire, come back again. Now we look at this and we're like, okay, what does that mean? Well, history tells us that the watchman is telling the messenger from Edom that it's not truly Assyria you have to worry about. Yes, they're coming, and they are going to reign over you for a period. They are going to oppress you for a short period of time. But the real threat is coming from the very ones you partnered with, that being Babylon. Babylon is going to turn on you. Now, if you notice, this isn't in chronological order because last week we talked about Babylon falling. And this week, in this vision, Babylon is still a mighty empire. So before they fall, they're going to go after their allies. Now, who is really sending Babylon? That would be God. He is sending Babylon. This was going to be his wrath coming upon every single person that joined forces with this wicked empire. So here, Edom was thinking that they were safe because they partnered with Babylon. But that hub that they needed in Duma was going to be overtaken by the Assyrians. Then the Assyrians were going to oppress the Edomites. But then it would be Babylon that would come along and truly take out God's wrath upon them. Now, again, that was a very short oracle. That's about all we know about that. So what is it that we're gathering from this information? Once again, through this vision, God is showing his own that you cannot rely upon a foreign army for protection. He's already told them this once. They disobeyed him. So now he is showing him through his sovereignty that he is the one in complete and total control. Now we move on to a different oracle. Look at verse 13, the oracle concerning Arabia. So now, again, we have Arabia, another partner of Babylon, whose God's wrath is coming for. And this time it's coming for them. And it's interesting, because what we're going to be seeing in these upcoming verses are going to be different than what we've seen in the previous chapters. Because we're going to talk about refugees here. And these refugees, they're going to be fleeing to the inner lands. Because Babylon is eventually going to come after the coastlands. And by way of them coming after the coastlands in Arabia, people are going to hear about this. They're going to see this. There's nothing they can do about it. So they start charging inward. But where they're charging isn't going to be able to provide for the amount of people that are coming. So everywhere that Babylon was taking over, people were going to be fleeing from those lands. And they would be coming from hundreds of miles away. This is going to be a terror like no other they've ever experienced before. Continuing in this verse, it says, in the thickets in Arabia you will lodge, O caravan of Dedanites. So it's going to be awful. The Dedanites were a group of merchants. They were going to be heading home. They were going to be traveling for business. And here they are heading back to their homeland, but they're not going to be able to continue on the main paths in which they always traveled. Why? There are going to be so many refugees coming in, they're going to have to travel off the beaten path and hide at night in the thickets. The refugees were going to be desperate. That they would rob the merchants, take whatever they could so that they could provide for their families. This was what was going to be taking place. This is how many people were moving inward. But there wasn't enough food. They had to leave the coastline so quick they could not take the supplies that they needed. So they were going to rob anyone and everyone along the way. So you have these merchants pulling off the road in the dead of night, hiding their caravans. But the merchants, they wouldn't just be hiding from the refugees. No, the foreign armies were coming after the refugees, so they too were moving inward. So you see how God's wrath is not only sending foreign armies to attack the allies, but they are also sending refugees. It's so strange when you kind of think about it that way. And you think about what's actually taking place today with us. Something that would end up happening with the merchants. The refugees would find some of them, rob them, and take their supplies. They too were hungry and thirsty. But for the ones who were used to the travel along the beaten path, they would pass numerous oases. And by way of that water, they could be able to refuel. But because they're off of the normal path, they're running out of water. So, look at what it says in verse 14. It says, "To the thirsty, bring water." So these merchants would be struggling. And it was going to be up to this town north of where they were traveling called Tamar. And Tamar would have to come and bring these merchants water, or they were going to die. This was how the vision was playing out. But not only were they going to have to bring the merchants water, look at what else verse 14 says. It says, "Meet the fugitive with bread, O inhabitants of the land of Tema." Now, right now, these merchants and the caravans and the refugees, they were not a blessing from God. They were actually his wrath coming upon the land of Tema also. Tema was also depending on these foreign armies. So God was going to punish this land, Tema. They were going to have to give their food and water away to the caravans and to the fugitives who were fleeing inward. Now again, just because Tema was providing water and food, this wasn't a blessing, it was a curse upon this land. It was God's wrath being poured out upon this land. Because Tema, they didn't have food, nor did they have water in abundance. You think about crops. You take what God gives you. It's not as if you can plan for a mass exodus inward. You can't plan for refugees to be falling inward because they're fleeing from this foreign army. So now you're going to have to deal with a food shortage. But not only a food shortage, it could affect your water supply as well. Now, while we're all these people running inward, look at verse 15. "For they have fled from the swords, from the drawn sword, from the bent bow, and from the press of battle." These people knew that they could not fight the evil empire. There's no way possible. As soon as they got word that the evil empire was closing in on them, they had no choice but to run. The coastlands, they were going to be conquered. They were going to be overthrown. And from those coastlands, the people would push inward. So it wasn't the actual land in the central part of Arabia. It wasn't going to be decimated by war. It was going to be decimated by an influx of people. This was God's wrath falling. Because at one time, Arabia didn't have to worry about their food supply. They didn't have to worry about land. It was in abundance. Supplies were numerous. But we see that's going to change. Once again, God gave this vision to show his own people that who they are relying upon, that foreign army, is the wrong one. A foreign army was never going to be able to protect them. God is showing them how everyone is being decimated by whoever he sends, that being God. It'll be the Babylonians for a little while, but he will crush them. It'll be the Assyrians for a little while, and he will crush them. And he will continue to rise up another empire to bring about his wrath. But in this vision, something different is happening. Like I said, he is using the refugees to show his anger. Now we see in verse 16, it says, "For thus the Lord said to me, within a year, according to the years of a hired worker, all the glory of Kedar will come to an end." Now when it talks about within a year, according to the years of a hired worker would work for exactly a year, and then they would receive their payment. So why this is being said in this vision, God is telling Isaiah this is going to happen soon. Now, Kedar was well known by God's own. They were a traveling group, but they were a group made up of fierce warriors. They were a tribe that would live in tents. So even though they were made up of fierce warriors, they were no match for God's wrath. God was going to run through them with ease. The powerful, no matter how high they may stand, they are no match for the Almighty. Look at verse 17. "And the remainder of the archers, of the mighty men, of the sons of Kedar will be few, for the Lord, the God of Israel, has spoken." Arabia was going to be humbled. And this humility wasn't going to come from the military powers that God sent. It was coming from God himself. God humbled Arabia. God humbled those that Judah was relying upon. God was showing Judah that no man could protect them, for he was their protector, their provider, and their Savior. Once again, what we are seeing is everything that takes place in this world, every single war, every single natural disaster, even the influx of people spreading into a nation, all of it is controlled by the Almighty Sovereign God. He decrees all things. Now, maybe you're thinking this. So with our borders being open in the way that they are, is this punishment from God? To be honest with you, I don't know. I don't know. It could be. At this point in time, we are a nation that doesn't want God. We know in the story of Isaiah, the vision that we just looked at, it was punishment for them. But as for us, I'm not certain. Questions?